Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to hand over to Max Phillips from Ecologi, who's going to explain to us a little bit more about carbon offsetting, but also what Ecologi can offer in that respect. Max, over to you.
So yeah, just a little bit of context about Ecologi to start with, and I'm going to go into a bit more of a global overview of carbon offsetting and a bit of kind of climate solutions. Obviously had some great talks so far, so we'll just kind of build on and reiterate quite a few of the points that have been made. So who are Ecologi? Next slide, please. So we are a platform for climate action. We were set up about 2.5 years ago now, and we're a community of about 11,000 businesses, mostly based around the UK, and about 30,000 individuals, all of whom are kind of working towards contributing to different kinds of climate solutions, in the hope of having, by 2040, reached our kind of big, hairy, audacious target of reducing 50% of global emissions and helping our partner businesses reduce their emissions to hit 50% of global CO2 emissions that need to be brought down by 2040. So obviously that's a really big, ambitious target, but by kind of working with as many businesses as possible, we really think that there's a lot that can happen through kind of collective action. Next slide, please. So this is kind of our core mission, and as we heard kind of about communications earlier, one of the really important things is to state what your values are as a company, and every decision that Ecologi makes at the end of the day revolves around this goal and whether or not our decisions will support it, and our kind of journey to get to 50%. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a quick kind of snapshot of our impact so far. So we've planted about 35 million trees around the world in different sites. Some of those in the UK, a few 100,000 in different places around the UK. But we mostly are focused on kind of areas that have been degraded and are particularly cost effective to restore. So certain sites, for instance, one of our main planting sites is in Madagascar, and there it's much more cost effective to restore this area of land back to be kind of very biodiverse, very native species of trees, compared to the same amount of land in the UK would cost a lot more to restore, which is partly why we have this global focus. And then aside from the tree planting, we've also done about 1.5 million tons of CO2 offsets. So this talk is about offsetting, so I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about what that means. Next slide, please. So yeah, I've skipped out a little bit about climate crisis and going into that because I thought Rufus did a really good job on introducing that right at the start. So I feel like everyone's kind of aware of the risks and the problems we're facing at the moment. But the one thing I did want to highlight is just that the latest UN IPCC report has come out last Monday, and that's just a really good starting place if you're interested in getting a bit of an idea of kind of where the climate science is at the moment. So yeah, just signposting that. We have a blog about it on Ecologi if you wanted to have slightly simplified takeaways from there. Next slide, please. So solutions, what can we do about it? What's in our control? That's kind of where to start. So the next slide, there's kind of two main ways that we as a society can get to net zero and stay, below the very scary levels of warming and the implications they have on kind of the planet and its health and all of those impacts on human civilization too. So there are two broad categories of solutions. One is reducing emissions and the other is removing emissions. So to start with reducing, from a business perspective, you can split reducing emissions into two categories. One is inside of your value chain and the other is outside of your value chain. So inside of your value chain, some of the points that have been raised before is about, if you were to change the types of food that you were serving or switch to an EV fleet or switch to renewable energy as a business, these are all ways that you can reduce the direct emissions that your business is having, and the emissions that are kind of entangled within all of your operations. So that's within your value chain. And then outside of your value chain is all the other things happening around the world that also need to be improved and made more efficient and supported so that we can reduce emissions there too. So when you're hearing about offsetting, what that means in essence is that you are contributing to solutions outside of your value chain so that emissions can be reduced where those projects are happening. So obviously it's kind of first and foremost, you need to be doing things within your business. And if you are not doing that, then you will kind of lose credibility, and any engagements you put out, as someone pointed out earlier, people will pick holes in them. I think that was Laura. Yeah, everyone is kind of keenly aware of not wanting to greenwash and looking into statements that businesses have made to make sure that that is the case. So always is most important to start with reducing your own emissions, but then you can look and see what you can contribute beyond your value chain. And that's effectively what offsetting is. And then removing emissions, sorry, just last point in that last slide, is about kind of, there's two categories again there. One is nature-based solutions, like tree planting and kind of kelp farming. There's lots of ocean-based projects, and the other is new kind of technological solutions that actively remove carbon from the atmosphere. So this, instead of preventing more greenhouse gases from being released, there's kind of this new category of solutions that are directly removing CO2 and the other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And that's really important because, as this graph kind of shows, some of these, some of that brown area, some of the ways the world currently works, we don't expect we'll be able to make them completely net zero in terms of how much they're emitting. But if we combine them with removal technologies, then that can mean that net it is zero. So yeah, next slide, please. So this has kind of been touched on in lots of ways, and apologies if the diagram is a little bit small, but I just wanted to highlight the kind of key path that your typical business would take at the moment. So from our perspective, before you're able to do lots of comms about how sustainable and green you are and all these various things you're doing, the kind of core operational steps you need to take all revolves around aiming towards being a net zero company. At the end of the day, that's kind of the target. And again, everyone's mentioned it, aligned with science-based initiative. That's kind of the gold star at the end of the journey. And the steps that we consider really important for that is, first of all, measuring your footprint. Like Laura was saying from Planet Mark, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So that's definitely the most important places to understand where your emissions are coming from, and whether that's business-wide or, as Andrew was saying, kind of from specific products, maybe your food or anything else it might be. So measure and you understand what emissions you're responsible for and where they're coming from. And then you need to put in place kind of long-term strategies to help you continuously reduce those emissions that are within your business, within your value chain. And that's, a lot of those things aren't immediate solutions. So that's why it takes quite a while. You can't just get to zero tomorrow. A lot of these things take quite a few years to work on. But one of the things that you can do quite quickly and quite effectively in the meantime, whilst you're working on reducing your footprint, is also to fund different carbon reduction projects around the world through offsetting your footprint. And so that's where the term carbon neutral comes in. So if you've directly offset the amount of greenhouse gases that you've measured to be your carbon footprint, you can then claim to be carbon neutral. And of course, that carbon neutral is just a stepping stone to get towards net zero at the end of the day. But it is just a really important way to show that you're contributing to all these different solutions around the world as much as you can. And then once you have this kind of core 4 steps, that kind of game plan in place across the business, then you can start being a bit more playful about your communications and your engagement, both internally and externally. And as was kind of recommended earlier, having internal green teams is really important. Having people feel empowered to champion these causes within the business, setting up cycle to work schemes, or lots of our partner businesses have started using trees as incentives or as rewards. So for kind of filling out surveys or signing up for newsletters, they're using trees as a reward for doing these things. And that's not to say that you can do just tree planting and not have everything else in place. You absolutely need to have all these core targets and reductions and everything in place first. Otherwise, it is just greenwashing. But once you do, you can then start using contributions to funding different climate solutions as a way of engaging different audiences. Next slide, please. So just to kind of touch on the role of offsetting a bit. There's been a lot of disagreement in the climate space about how effective offsetting can be as a strategy, whether it's all dud and your money's not actually having an impact, and kind of generally whether or not you should trust and engage in carbon offsetting. So the perspective of myself and the team at Ecologi is really that offsets are a really important part of the solution because they help us reduce the emissions in other places around the world. And often it's a lot more cost effective to say help fund 1 ton of CO2 emissions reductions, say in India, by helping fund a solar farm than it is for an equivalent ton of reductions within your business. And that's not to say that that reduction within your business isn't important. That's absolutely the essential thing to be doing, but it's just to say that especially in the UK, we have a privilege of the pound is worth a lot compared to other global currencies, and we can have an outsized impact by helping other kind of countries and other projects around the world, helping providing funding so that they can provide renewable energy or other projects like that. I'll go into some of the project types in a moment. So yeah, they're an important part of the solution, but not sufficient alone. And we just have to make sure that those reductions, whether it's as an individual or as a business, that we're reducing our own footprint as much as possible first, and then contributing to offsetting above and beyond that. So 3 main types of carbon offsetting projects. One is renewable energy. So that's things like supporting solar farms or wind farms. Another is conservation. So it might be protecting an area of rainforest or of peatland. And the third is humanitarian. So that's often things like providing clean water access or clean cook stoves, which again help reduce emissions in those local communities. By, say, for clean cook stoves, because they're much more fuel efficient, which means fewer greenhouse gases are released when people are cooking and providing their food. So those are the kind of 3 categories. If you're looking into telling a particular kind of story, maybe for your business, it might be that renewable energy is something that really connects to one of your business's values or stories, and funding renewable energy projects around the world is actually going to really align and tell a nice story for your kind of marketing team. Or it might be the case conservation. You might find a particular project in Indonesia where some of your food products come from, and actually therefore you want to contribute to something aligned there. So lots of different categories of solutions and lots of different ways you can support them. But yeah, just to highlight, those are kind of the 3 main categories you can look at funding. Next slide. So when you're going out to find your carbon offsets, there's kind of, and if you remember one thing from this, it'd just be this, and there's 2 standards that are seen as kind of the most effective and rigorous ones. And this is globally speaking. I know Doug is about to come on and tell us some really interesting stuff about UK carbon offsetting projects and tree planting in the UK. But global projects, there's kind of these 2 standards. One is gold standard, and the other is verified carbon standard, which is attributed by a body called Verra. And if you're looking into projects and you want to make sure that they are rigorous and that your money is really having an impact, it's not just going into a hole, or it's not going to turn out in a few years' time that actually you're funding a project that had some negative side effects or whatever it might have been, then as the kind of baseline, I'd say finding projects that have one of these two certifications to their name is the most important place to start. So just as kind of a tip, if you're looking at getting some offsets, I'd say that's the best place to start. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of sum up with a really quick, I guess, summary of what a lot of the speakers have touched on today in different ways. And this is the model that we use at Ecologi of thinking about the three kind of things you can do as a business for climate. So those are measuring, funding, and engaging. So we've heard a lot about measuring today, getting consultants in to measure your business-wide footprint, measuring footprints from particular products, any activities within the business that are producing emissions. If you measure them, you might then get insights in how you can reduce those emissions. So that's a really important place to start. Along the side of that is funding solutions. And again, that can be within or outside of the business, but a lot of the time it requires upfront investment into new kind of tools and technologies. So within your business, switching suppliers is going to be an upfront cost that you will have to front. But providing that funding is really important long term, and similarly funding climate solutions like offsetting and other things like that is just a really effective way that as a business you can have an outsized impact that can go above and beyond what your kind of negative impact is. As sad as it is, by every business by existing is going to have somewhat of a negative impact. But if we're funding more and more solutions, then actually we can make sure that overall it's kind of net positive. And then around those two pieces is the engagement and telling the stories of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And if you haven't done the measuring and some of the funding, then your engagement piece will fall apart and people will pick holes in it and it won't really stand up. But if you have these two kind of central aspects going on, then you can really engage your audiences and know that you've got some robust stories to tell and get them excited that you're a climate friendly and responsible brand. So yeah, that's just a kind of quick model that I like to use, at least find it useful to simplify when I'm thinking about taking action on climate. And that's it for me. Yeah, if you have any questions, please do reach out, and I'm sure we have a few to discuss now.
Thank you very much, Max. Andrew has a question for you. Have you seen the Wild Carbon Initiative, which is Kent-based, and do you think it looks credible? Do you expect SBTI new guidelines, food, land use and agricultural, will affect the kinds of nature-based offsets that are possible?
So the Wild Carbon Initiative in Kent, I actually haven't seen. Sounds very interesting. I will definitely have a look at that. So unfortunately, I can't pass opinion on how credible it looks or not, but certainly I will get back to you on that, Andrew. And the new SBTI guidelines, I think there will almost certainly be more stringent guidance on the types of offsets and the criteria that are necessary to align with SBTI and net zero, etc. And one of the important things there is the difference between reductions and removals. So for instance, when talking about nature-based offsets, one of the common points of confusion is that if you are conserving an area, say part of a rainforest, then you are reducing the emissions that would otherwise have occurred if that area was cut down. By contrast, if you are reforesting somewhere, that's a removal of carbon, but it's over the long term because it's over the lifespan of those trees. So you can't make too many claims about those trees removing all of your footprint or whatever it might be in the near term, because they have to grow up first and all of that has to happen. So there's definitely a lot of question marks still around how we judge different projects, and there's all these terms like additionality and permanence in terms of so additionality is whether this impact would have happened without the funding, and permanence is how long the carbon is stored for or how long that carbon reduction maintains to be the case. So there's a lot of questions around that, and yeah, unfortunately, I'm not an expert. I can't give all the answers, but certainly SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative, is kind of the best place to look and is seen globally as the authority on this. So if you're looking for more guidance, I would always just keep an eye on what they're saying.
Thank you. Sean says or asks very roughly, what is the cost to offset a ton of carbon? And if you use your or a similar system to offset your whole footprint, does this mean you can say you are carbon neutral?
Yeah, so roughly the cost of offsetting a ton of carbon at the moment is scaling is going up quite quickly, let's say. So lots of businesses are getting involved in purchasing offsets, which is really exciting, especially since COP26. But that means that the cost is going up quite a lot at the moment. So it's around £10 a ton is a very kind of rough average to have in your head. So it depends on the kinds of projects. Some nature-based projects are a much higher premium because they have co-benefits around biodiversity and local employment and other things like that. So typically nature-based projects are more expensive, and then renewable energy projects and others are a bit cheaper. But that's kind of the ballpark. And then, yeah, if you offset your whole footprint, you can then say you're carbon neutral. There's just a few kind of, I guess, caveats I've put in around that. One is that carbon neutral, there are a few standards coming out now around carbon neutral and exactly what it means, but none of them have been kind of globally adopted just yet. So it's a little bit of a wild west in terms of some people say carbon neutral and mean a very different thing to someone else saying carbon neutral. But certainly if you've offset your footprint, you can start to use that term. What I would recommend, just kind of building what everyone said before, is that you make sure you have those kind of internal aims and reductions happening in your business, because if you don't and you start saying you're carbon neutral, although it's true, it doesn't have the same kind of authenticity, and therefore you're much more liable to get some accusations of greenwashing.
Thank you, Max. Anna asks, and maybe this is a nice segue into Doug's presentation after yours. Is it not possible to offset carbon emissions via, oops, now my screen went. Is it not possible to offset carbon emissions via tree planting ourselves? I understand you can pay for tree planting conservation, but is it possible to take this into our own hands?
So absolutely, if you want to get planting some trees, 100%, I would recommend it. It's a lot of fun. There's lots of different projects around the UK that are open for volunteers to get involved in, or fill in your garden if you've got some spaces that could do with some trees. Absolutely. The point, I guess, there around it being offsetting, one of the things, and that's kind of related to Andrew's comment about SBTI and different kinds of offsetting that's coming into place now, is the whole process around offsetting is becoming much more standardized. So although planting a few trees is certainly going to have a good impact over the long term of those trees' lifespan, it doesn't necessarily have all the various verifications in place that will allow you to kind of say that this is a carbon offset in the same way that a business would want a certain level of kind of rigor behind the process, instead of just saying, hey, we've got this kind of farm with lots of trees on it. And I know Doug's about to talk about the kind of UK carbon code. So there's certain standards, but yes, it's great to plant trees yourself, but calling it an offset is just where I'd be a bit careful, because aligning with standards is where you can get that kind of seal of approval, and other people then know that they can trust what you've done and that it is offsetting, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Max. That's a question I had actually myself, without going into too much detail what the golden standard is exactly, but I imagine that a lot of people may wonder, okay, I'm investing in a project in Madagascar, and how is that going to be monitored, and how are we going to be sure that in 10 years' time that project is still alive and doing well?
Absolutely. So one of the great things about both of those standards is that they require kind of regular reporting on the projects to make sure that they're meeting their emissions reductions kind of stated targets. That is how they're getting their credits that they're then able to sell. So there is a lot of reporting on the projects ongoing, built into achieving one of those levels of certification. So that's why we kind of recommend them as the best place to start. On top of that, many services and partners like ourselves at Ecologi, we have our kind of climate impact team who provide an extra level of monitoring on different projects. And that's why I would recommend working with partners who work in this space, because they're then able to provide an extra layer of, yes, we will be monitoring this on your behalf and on all of our businesses' behalf to make sure that it continues to have a positive impact 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, whatever it might be. So definitely the long-term impacts and the permanence of things is one of the biggest question marks, because to a certain extent, no one can guarantee what's going to happen in 10 years' time. But by working with standards and with kind of entities whose obligation it is, you can get a lot more guarantee and certainty that at least they'll have a mechanism in place if something does happen to take care of it.
I know that there was discussion at COP26 about the responsibility that the industrial countries, developed countries, I don't know what the right term is, have towards the sub-Saharan countries, for example, who are suffering most from our polluting behaviors in the past. Now, so there is a whole social argument to offsetting as well. Where does Ecologi stand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. And it's not just environmental impact that you can help negate, but actually the positive social impact of employment, if it's renewable energy jobs or if it's conservation jobs, that's still employment to plant those trees or to protect that area. And a lot of the time, different offsetting projects, all gold standard projects tell you which UN Sustainable Development Goals are also supported, and some verified carbon projects also tell you that information on UN SDGs. And a lot of the time, there are side projects attached to these, such as education in the local community, and things that are kind of ongoing human benefits alongside the kind of environmental CO2 benefit that is more directly being sold and provided. So certainly that's really important. And I guess one way I like to frame it is that, paying if you have £1 and you want to put it towards a climate solution, £1 going towards a solar panel in the UK is important, but you'll get your solar panel will be pretty small. £1 going towards a solar panel in India, one, it's going to get more energy. Two, if it's like a large farm, you'll be able to fund a bigger solar panel, in effect, if this analogy is making any sense. So basically, the way I see it is that by helping these countries, by providing kind of funding through offsetting and other schemes, we are able to help them develop and reduce emissions more cost effectively than we might be able to do here at home. It's important to do it here too, but it's just a nice way of thinking about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. James Traynor shared, I think, a link to Wilder Carbon, the Kent-based initiative. So for those of you who are interested, please click on the link in the chat box. Thanks, Max.